Hi everyone, it's Donovan with Serverless Solutions, and in today's episode, we are continuing our series on building secure agentic AI. In today's video, we're going to set up authorization in Microsoft Entra Identity Services. We're going to add that to an already existing MCP server that we've integrated with VS Code. If you haven't watched the previous videos in this series, I highly recommend you go check them out. Let's start with a brief overview of the authorization specification for MCP servers. The client, in our case VS Code, is going to make a request to the MCP server without an access token. We're going to return a 401 response and tell VS Code where it can go to get more information about how to authenticate with us. VS Code is going to reach out to that endpoint, which is hosted on our MCP server, that's going to let VS Code know that if it wants to talk to us, it's going to need to talk to Entra. At that point, VS Code and Azure Entra Identity Services are going to do the OAuth song and dance, and we're going to get a native experience that allows us to authenticate with our Azure tenant. From that point on, VS Code will include the access token that it retrieves from Entra with each subsequent request it makes to our MCP server, which we can then validate. Now, the first thing we're going to have to do is set up an app registration in our Azure tenant. Hi everyone, it's Donovan from the editing booth. It turns out that editing out all the sensitive information on this video is a bit of a pain. So rather than walking through setting up the app registration as part of the video, I'm going to drop some links down in the comments so that you can follow along there with Microsoft's documentation. It's really not that complicated. You're just going to create your app registration, grab the tenant ID, grab the client ID, and expose a scope on your API. So it's really just 3 steps, no big deal. Like I said, we'll drop some links down in the description, and now we'll cut back on over to the coding. Jumping back into the code, I've added 2 new crates to our dependencies. We have .env, which allows us to use an environment file so that I can save that application and tenant ID and use them throughout my application. The other is Axum Extra, where we include the typed header feature so that we can grab the bearer token from the header directly without doing any custom code. When it comes to the project, I've added a config module, and all this does is allows us to access those values that I saved in the environment file throughout our application. And now for the last bit of house cleaning, I'm going to add a few more constants that we'll use repeatedly throughout this series. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and get started building that metadata endpoint that's going to tell VS Code to talk to Entra if they want to talk to us. Here in the metadata module, I will go ahead and add some boilerplate here. This includes our using statements, a useful constant that I don't want to fat finger during this video, and a struct that we'll use in our response to tell VS Code where to go authenticate. Let's go ahead and define our endpoint and return that information to the caller. We'll instantiate our metadata here. Use VS Code to fill in the missing fields, and finally assign our values. Our resource is going to be the MCP server that needs authentication. In authorization servers, we'll specify that we are going to use Microsoft Entra to log in, and specifically our tenant. For scopes, we're going to include our app ID URI along with the named scope. And finally, for bearer method supported, we're going to tell VS Code that we want this access token in the header. With that done, we'll return our response. And it looks like I've made a mistake, so we'll swap this response to into response, and that should be exactly what we need. Next, we'll swap on over to main to update our router. Let's go ahead and rename this MCP router because this is the one that's going to have authentication on it once we wire it up. And then we'll set up our metadata router. We'll use the well-known constant to add the URI that I will definitely mess up on typing. And then we'll add that function we defined as part of our GET request. We'll include the crate. Finally, we will redefine our router by taking our MCP router and merging it with our metadata router. With the server running, let's go ahead and test out that brand new endpoint. I got a 200 OK, and you'll just have to trust me, bro, because I am not pulling that screen down to show you the tenant ID and client ID because my editor will kill me. With our metadata endpoint setup, it's time to jump into our Auth module. Once again, I'll start by pasting in some boilerplate to get us started. We're going to create a simplified validate token method, which will take a look at the bearer token in the header. And if there is none, return that 401 response that we talked about earlier. We're going to go ahead and use match to ensure that we handle all possible options for that bearer token. Now we want to focus first on what happens if there is no bearer token. In that case, we're going to build a response. Once again, we are going to give that status code unauthorized. We're going to include a header, and that's going to have our www authenticate header. And then we're going to give it that information about where to get our resource metadata. So we're telling it to look at our MCP local host that's running and that well-known endpoint that we defined earlier. We're going to give it an empty body. I'm going to be lazy and unwrap this. Now, if we actually have a bearer token, we're going to go ahead and continue on in this video, but in the next video, we'll talk about how to verify that access token. With our function created to validate the token, it's time to use that in our MCP router. So let's hop on over to main again. Now we can create a layer for our router to apply a middleware that's going to call that function we created for every route within that router. Now that we have everything set up, we should be able to start our MCP server and kick off that integration with VS Code and start our authentication flow. Now that the server is running, let's go ahead and kick off the integration with VS Code. As expected, we're getting that pop-up that's going to require us to authenticate with Azure Entra Identity Services. Although I'm not showing it here, once you authenticate, it's going to give you a notification that permissions are requested from Visual Studio Code that would like to access that scope you exposed. So you can go ahead and click next on those types of menus, click checkboxes, do all the normal things, and you'll be good to go. If we look at the logs, we can see that the MCP demo was started, that VS Code requested that authorization metadata, that it waited forever for me to authenticate, and finally, it discovered 3 tools. So let's go ahead and make sure it's still working. Let's ask what Pokemon are available to catch. And as we can see, VS Code has used the tool that we created in our MCP server and used Microsoft Entra Identity Services in order to pass on that bearer token to our service. I hope you guys have enjoyed setting up some basic authorization flow for this MCP server. And in our next video, we'll work on actually verifying that token using JSON web keys. If you don't know what those are, don't worry about it. We got you covered. See you next time, and thanks for watching.